Okie dokie. Hello, everybody. Wait a minute or so for people to show up. Vertical centering, unfortunately, is not possible in CSS. No, it's easy to do. Comb, you know that. Okay, so today what I was thinking would be fun to do was we published this article yesterday where we kind of walked through an iterative redesign of the Laravel IO forums. And I've been looking for a project to try and just like build with Tailwind, just to sort of dog food it on something new and see what sort of issues I run into and make sure that I can do everything with it that I want to be able to do with it, and just sort of like poke some holes in it and see if there's anything we need to tweak or improve going forward. So I thought this would be an interesting example. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to use our current sort of pre-alpha version of Tailwind CSS to try and implement this new design and just kind of walk through how it's all going to work and talk a little bit about the setup and configuration process, and hopefully give you some insights into what the workflow would be like building something with Tailwind. So to get started, I have an empty Laravel project where I'm going to build it just because Laravel Mix is a great, easy way to do your asset compilation and stuff, so we're going to do it here. So the way that you would get started with Tailwind is you would pull it in via npm. You can't do that yet, so right now I'm just using a private repository where it's getting pulled in from. And then once it's pulled in, you just need to update whatever your asset compilation strategy is. In this case, we're using Laravel Mix. So I'm using less as my standard preprocessor, although I don't really need to take advantage of many less features at all anymore with the way Tailwind works. But I still like less, so we'll still roll with that. Mostly using it for things like importing files and stuff like that. And then here we set up some PostCSS options. So we pull in the Tailwind PostCSS plugin. And then this is a function that you can then invoke passing through some configuration for your site. So this is not required. You can just use the default Tailwind config, which is pretty fully featured and will be really good for just getting rolling with prototyping and stuff like that. But for any real projects, you're probably going to want to be able to customize it. So this can be a JSON file. It's a little bit easier with a JS file because the formatting is a little bit less restrictive than it is in JSON. So let's take a look at what this config file looks like. So what I've done is I've copy and pasted the default Tailwind config file, and we're just going to use that to totally blow out the default config and just override it with whatever we want. So here it is. We got a ton of configuration keys here. So the first one is breakpoints, which is kind of just like your standard mobile first breakpoint style. So these are min width breakpoints. And it's going to create responsive versions of your utilities at each one of these breakpoints. You can also do more complex breakpoints here if you wanted to. So if you wanted to say min, some value, and then max, some other value, you can do this. Jonathan Renning, who I'm working on Tailwind with, uses this feature for stuff like fancy sidebar layouts and stuff. So sometimes you want the same sort of screen size to exist in two sort of segments of breakpoints, depending on whether or not like the sidebar is visible, that sort of thing. So you can do some kind of interesting things there. But for most standard kind of basic situations, you just need to specify the size that you want for the min width for that breakpoint. So I'm using, I think these are Bootstrap's default breakpoints here. I just assumed that those were well researched and people are pretty, used to them. So it seemed wise to just roll with those. The next key here is your color palette. So all this commented out stuff is just me extracting all of the colors that Steve and I kind of picked out for this redesign here, just so it's going to be easy for us to configure that. But I wanted to walk through the default config, which is still a work in progress, but it's a very full color palette. So you got like a pretty nice sort of cool gray scale with a little bit of blue saturation in there. And then we have like every color of the rainbow in like 4 varieties. So red, orange, yellow, green, teal, blue, indigo, purple, and pink. And you can reference these for any of your other utilities. So after that, you do stuff like configuring your text utilities. So this configures different font family utilities. So we want to have like a helper for telling something to be a specific sans serif font. Here's like our list of fonts. Here's our serifs. Here's our monospace. These keys are totally customizable. You don't have to name them this way. But again, we try to recommend sensible defaults so that it's pretty, easy for people to work with. I have text sizes. So we have like kind of a pretty reasonable type scale here. It's not based on anything scientific, just kind of a eyeballing an experience and trying to keep the numbers sort of even. I hate when people use like fancy modular type scales and you end up with like, 25.7 pixels or something stupid like that. So everything here is done in rems so that you can kind of scale the whole site by just changing the root font size. But they're sensibly picked using 16 pixels as a base so that everything kind of lands on nice even numbers. For the breakpoints, you can have as many as you want. You can name them whatever you want. If we wanted to call this phone and this tablet and this desktop or whatever, there's nothing stopping you from doing that. It's completely customizable. We have some configuration for different font weights. So again, just kind of a standard set. Some frameworks try to give you like every font weight from 100 to 900. I think that's a little bit too much flexibility. I think it's better to kind of try and stick with as few as possible. In this design, we're actually only using 2 font weights. So if we wanted to reduce the size of our CSS here, all we'd have to do is basically get rid of the ones that we don't need. So in this case, we're only going to be using regular and bold, and that'll cut down on a bunch of definitions. Leading, this is line height helpers. So this lets you use utilities like .letting tight to have a tighter line height, or letting loose to have a looser line height. And again, you can have as many of these as you want. You can rename them. Tracking is letter spacing, so we got a few of those by default. And then you can also specify colors for your text. So here we're actually using a sort of a slightly different naming scheme for text colors than we are just for the color palette. That I think is good the way that we've done it. But basically what you can do here is you can say, I want to have a utility called text light. So this is saying, this is the name of the color, and this references a color in the color palette. So what it's going to do is it's going to look for this white string up inside this color palette up here, and if it finds it, it's going to use that value. If it doesn't find it, then it's just going to assume that you pass through a literal color value, and it's just going to fall back to that. So here we have light text, which is meant to go on dark backgrounds, light soft, which is meant to be like a slightly lower contrast again, and even lower contrast. And here we're just using the opacity to control that so that it looks pretty nice on different background colors. And then here we can also just reference any of the other colors that we want to have available for text. So you can have this object syntax, which lets you sort of alias the colors to different names, or you can just do an array, and this is basically the same as, specifying it twice. So it's just kind of meant to make that a little bit simpler and less repetitive. So out of the box, we configure every single color in the color palette available for typography, although realistically, you probably will never do that. So that's why it's important to be able to publish this config file and just go through and basically trim out everything that you're not going to use. I think it's better to provide more out of the box than less, so that it's easy for people to sort of play with the framework and prototype things. But we want to make it really easy for you to keep that file size as low as you need to as well. Got some configuration for background colors, same sort of approach. Borders, so we have like a utility for just .border. And this kind of configures what that should look like, the default border. So it should be 1 pixel, and that should be the color that we use. You have some width modifiers, so you can have fatter borders or eliminate a border if you want. These are like border radius utilities. So these are presented as like .rounded, so the default rounded helper is a quarter rem. Rounded SM is going to be tighter, LG is going to be looser, and then pill is going to be like a full-on sort of pill approach. Then also border colors, again, we provide all of them out of the box. Then we got helpers for sizing. So this just is useful for stuff like images and stuff, right? Where maybe you have an image tag and you just want to be able to say like, this should be 2 rems tall. So that's going to be height 8, width 8. And you can kind of control that this way. Bunch of percentage helpers, min and max heights, just at sensible values that are pretty common. Again, if you want to delete these, you can. If you want to add more, you can. Same thing for padding, margin, negative margin. We got some nice default box shadows that are pretty versatile, but of course you can change these to be whatever you want. Z-index scale, and then a set of opacity helpers. And that's all that's kind of configurable out of the box. So this is probably looks pretty overwhelming, but the idea is whatever project you're working on, hopefully you have some sort of design system in place, and you would port that sort of design system over to a Tailwind config, and then you'd be done, and ideally you never have to touch this file ever again. So unlike frameworks like Bootstrap, where customizing them is not really heavily documented, or not that it's not encouraged, but the vast majority of people are just pulling it down and using it as is. Customization is a very, very important part of Tailwind. So the idea is you kind of build your own framework out of the kind of building blocks that we provide. And that makes it a lot easier for every team that's using Tailwind on a project to have their projects look totally different. And you can never tell just like looking at the result, like, oh yeah, this is a Tailwind site, like you often can with a Bootstrap site. So that's kind of a little tour of the config. And here is my base CSS file. So we're going to have like a reset built into Tailwind, but we don't currently. So the reset that I'm personally using, which is probably going to heavily inspire the one that we ship with, is going to be normalized CSS, which is a really, really common tool for sort of normalizing differences between browsers. It's not like a really heavy-handed reset, but it tries to give you kind of a consistent starting point. Suit CSS base. Most people haven't actually heard of this, but this is created by the same guy who created normalize, and it's a slightly more opinionated reset on top of normalize, kind of specifically designed for web apps. So it gets rid of a bunch of default margins and stuff like that. And then on top of that, I just have a couple of really basic high-level changes. So I don't like text areas to be able to be horizontally resizable, so we'll just get rid of that. Images, I see no reason for them to bleed out of their container, so we'll set that to a max width of 100%. This is kind of a handy one. A lot of frameworks have helpers for setting the fill of SVGs, and I use SVGs for all my icons and stuff like that. So you might have like a .fill red class or something to make the SVG red. For me, that seems like a waste of declarations, since we already have things like .text red, for example. So what I like to do by default is I like to set all my SVGs fill attributes to just current color, which is a special CSS value that says use the current text color. So I can style my SVGs using text color instead of having to come up with like fill utilities. Couple things for buttons. The most interesting thing is probably here. So this is like a custom Tailwind at rule that lets us say use this class and mix it in. So if you look at kind of the resulting CSS here, you can see if we find button, where is it? Somewhere in here. After we get past all the normalized stuff. Yeah, here. So you can see this is what happens when we run this code through Tailwind's PostCSS plugin. Add apply says take the sans utility, which is for setting our sans serif font family, and just mix that in. Just copy all the properties from that and embed them right into here. So that's how we get this font family here. So this is a feature that I always used in Less. In Less, all you had to do is this. But we were able to sort of take that feature from Less, which I find really powerful for sort of composing components or reusing utilities. And by creating a custom at rule, now we've made it possible for anyone using any preprocessor to use that functionality, which is really cool. Cursor pointer. By default now, buttons have like just your regular arrow cursor, which probably is smart, but I don't find it to be what people are used to. I think people are used to like a hand cursor, so I just like to reset it to that. And then this one, is where all of your Tailwind utility classes are going to get spit out. So this is basically like a placeholder that you drop in your CSS file that says, hey, when you run this through Tailwind, replace this line with all Tailwind's generated utilities that are generated based on your config file. So if you look at the resulting CSS here, after that button class, this is where all of Tailwind's code shows up. It's 13,500 lines, which is a lot, but it gzips really well and it's super flexible. So yeah, I think that's like a good starting tour. And I think the next thing to do is to just try and use it to build out this design. So I've got a route here that just returns like some dummy thread data that we can use. And we've got like a empty HTML template here that we can kind of build this out in. So why don't we start by just taking a look at the sketch file and picking something to do first. So why don't we just start with this sort of header section. So it looks like this is going to be a div, right? This container, this whole white section. So let's start by, let's make it a header tag. We'll try to be cool and semantic. And inside that, it looks like we're going to have two sort of sections, right? There's going to be like a div here and a div here. So let's add that top div and the bottom div. And in the top one, we've got the Laravel.io logo on the left. So something I do with Laravel a lot is I actually stick my SVG files into Blade files, and then I can just use Laravel to include them. So here's the logo SVG, and I can pass a class parameter to it, which is kind of a cool little trick. So here we're going to have another div, and inside this div, let's include svg.logo, and we might have to add a class now. Here we're going to have like our nav section. So why don't we make that a div? We could make it a nav, but we'll make it a div. And that's going to be the nav, and then there's another div at the end with like our login and register links. So here we'll just add, none of these links are actually going to work, of course, right? So let's just get this sort of scaffolded out with no styling and then just work on styling it. So we'll just get the content in. So we got 5 links across the top: forum, pastebin, chat, jobs, and community. So let's just start by doing this the same way. Forum, pastebin, chat, jobs, community. And then this div underneath is where we have this forum sort of heading. And we made that an H1 in the write-up for the redesign, so let's make it an H1 here as well. And then over here we've got like a search. So let's put that in its own block level div element, just because it'll probably make it a little bit easier to style. We could make this an input type search. I don't think that has great browser support though, so we'll roll with text. And we'll give that a placeholder of search for threads. Would love to have an HTML style guide generated from Tailwind config. Yeah, that is actually, that's in the plans for sure. It'll be really cool to be able to basically take like the Tailwind documentation and generate like a custom version just for your project based on your stuff. Should be really possible to do. We're going to want to add this icon at some point. That's probably going to be one of the trickier things for us to do. So let's put a hold on that for now. And yeah, so this div is this one here. I think we actually probably want to stick another div around all of this stuff. Only because this is in a container, but the white bleeds all the way to the edges. So we're going to need like an extra layer here. So let's add another div here. Cut this out. Tab all that over. And that should give us kind of a decent starting point if we haven't made any silly mistakes. So let's just see what we get there. So this is looking pretty close to the final design already. We're almost ready to ship this. The first thing is, I think we're using Lato or Lato as the font here. So why don't I show you how we're going to set that up. So one of the challenges that we had with Tailwind was figuring out how do we let people configure sort of top level HTML stuff. So say you have like your app.less file or whatever. Normally, if you wanted to set like the default font family or whatever, right, you do it here, and this would be like system UI or whatever. It seemed weird to like find a key to put that stuff in here. And then Jonathan Rennick had this brilliant idea of, since the whole point of Tailwind in this like utility first approach is to be very class focused and stay out of your CSS as much as possible, why don't we just tell people to put classes on the HTML and body tag instead of styling it in CSS? So if we want to set our body tag to be our sans serif font by default, and if we look here, our sans serif font is Lato with a fallback to system UI, then we can just say sans, and then we're kind of done. So if we go here now, we got that Lato font showing up. So let's go ahead and turn off my fridge so it's not making annoying noises. And style this header. So one thing actually before we do that, the background color here is going to be this gray color, right? The only reason I'm saying that is because this should be set on the body and we need to set a white background here. So we can set that white background by setting the header to BG light, which is our lightest background. And if we look at the default config, and we look at backgrounds, you can see color light maps to white. We're going to want to configure these values to be like our actual grays and stuff soon. But for now, we can just roll with color white there. We're not going to see any difference, but that's okay. This div is going to be a container. So these containers work very similar to what you might be used to in Bootstrap, although they have a little less opinions baked in, and we'll get into that as we go here. So if we open this, you can see we've got a header and then we've got a container. And the container has a max width, but it's not centered by default. Bootstrap centers their containers by default and adds some padding on the left and right by default. But we don't. All we really do is literally just set the max width the same size as the matching media query. You're sort of on your own for setting padding and centering, which I think makes it a little bit more flexible personally. There's kind of a common trend these days for people to build these sites that don't have like centered content. If you look at like my buddy Steve's blog, for example, everything is kind of like left aligned. I mean, he might want to have like a container size, but he doesn't want the content centered. So it makes it a little bit more flexible in my opinion. In this case, we do want it centered though. So we can say margin X, which is like the X axis, auto, and that should center that content for us, and it does. We won't add any padding yet. We're going to want to set some widths on this stuff though. So let's set this top container here to flex so that we can put all this stuff next to each other. So I'll make this a flex container. And now our logo shrinks to nothing because it doesn't have a size defined. So we'll have to figure that out. Why don't we set some percentage widths on this stuff? So something that's sort of tricky about this layout is we want this nav to be centered. But this section and this section are not like the same width. So if we just sort of did like flex space between, it wouldn't quite work. So we're going to need to set this column and this column to be the same width. So we can do that using width helpers. So why don't we try making this like a quarter width column and this a quarter width column? And the way that we do that in Tailwind is by saying W for width and then 1/4 for 1/4. Now something that might look weird to you here is using like a slash in a CSS class. This is totally 100% possible. You just have to escape it in the actual CSS. So if you look at public app CSS and we look for width 1/4, is it in here? Oh yeah, I have regex enabled. That's why I wasn't finding it. For a minute, I thought I was working with a broken build. So you can see all you have to do is escape any non-normal characters, and then you can still use them as class names, which is pretty cool. So this lets us just be pretty expressive in saying this is a quarter width. This will be a half width. This will be a quarter width. Another thing worth mentioning, I have never implemented this design until today, so we're really, truly doing this live. Okay, so we're getting there. We got our stuff kind of in the right spot. So to get this centered, since this is, I guess like the easiest way to get that centered would just be probably, there's a couple of different ways we could do it. The way that I think we should do it here is set this to flex, and then we can use justify contents center to push everything to the center. So the helper for justify content center in Tailwind is just justify center. Oh, if I could type. So that gets that centered. This logo, we're going to want to like come up with a size for it. I don't know what the size is here. It's like 133 pixels or something. Divide that by 16. That's like 8 rem, which is kind of a 8.3 rem, which we don't have. So let's just look at sizes and pick something that's pretty close. So we can just say width 32 maybe for now. So let's give this a class of width 32. And all these sizing helpers are using a proportional scale by default. So 1 is a quarter rem, 4 is a rem. So divide this by 4, and that's the number that you're always going to get in rem. Originally, we just had a linear scale where the right-hand side wasn't linear, but the left-hand side was. That proved to be a little bit confusing in my experience. Making it proportional seemed better. If you have something as 4, but you wanted to double it, previously that might be 5 or it might be 6, depending on the scale on the right. Now we just know that 8 is always going to be double, even if it's only 2 sizes up. So a lot of trial and error into kind of coming up with some of this stuff. Okay, so there we got a Laravel IO. It looks like we've got maybe a 1 rem padding on the top and bottom of that box. So why don't we just do that? We'll do it on this container because we don't want to do it on this container. I guess we could do it. We can't do it on the whole container because we need this border to go to the bottom. So each one of these blocks has to be the full height of the container. So why don't we just add the padding to this one? And that can kind of dictate the total height of this entire nav. So we can set the padding, vertical padding, by saying py dash, then some sizing, right? So if we look at spacing helpers here, probably py4, which will be 16 pixels top and bottom, is a good place to start. We can see how that looks. You do have to restart mix when Tailwind.js has changed? That's a good question. You probably do have to restart mix. I don't think mix watch will actually catch those changes. However, you probably noticed so far that we haven't had to write any CSS yet. So it's not going to be a huge pain, but that might be something that we'll have to come up with a story for. Okay, so we got a little bit more padding there. I think we're going to want to make sure that all these flex items are centered with each other. So let me think about the best way to do that. Let's just maybe get this active state and inactive colors working here. So we got some colors stuff to deal with in general. We could add this bottom border. I'll show you how to do that bottom border. So on this flex container, which is a nav, we can just say border B. Now we're going to have a bottom border. Now this isn't the right color. If you look at our config file here, the borders are this light gray color. So we're going to want to define some grays. So I counted here that we had 7, which made it pretty convenient in terms of naming. So maybe we'll have gray, darkest. That can be some value. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we'll have dark or darkest, darker, dark, then a central gray, and then a light, lighter, lightest. And then we can kind of bring these values down and then assign those for the different things that they get used for. And again, this is one of those one-time configuration things, right? Once you've sort of settled on your design system or your branding for a particular project, you shouldn't have to be coming in here and doing this sort of thing. This is really just get Tailwind working the way that you want. Was I not copying this stuff? Okay. I'm not going to change these default names, but we'll probably be able to just delete them. keep this reference here so I remember what they're being used for. So for our border default, that's going to be this ECF0F1, which is going to be our gray light. So if we find borders in here, we can just set it to gray light. And let's mix this up. Hopefully we didn't break nothing. I see a lot of people do the 62.5% thing and then treat like that 1.6 rem as 16 pixels. For me, I find that kind of unintuitive. I want 1 rem to be like my standard font size. So if my regular body text size is 16 pixels, then I want 1 rem to be 16 pixels, personally. Okay, so we've got that underline. Let's try building out this nav section here. So it looks like we're going to have like some margin between each one. There's no padding here. You can see like the border, for example, is not any wider than the text. So let's head over here. We could try and measure this, although like I don't really care too much. It says 32, so that's actually going to be a nice number to work with. So for all these links, except for maybe the last one, we'll give it a margin right of 8, which is 2 rem. Okay. Cool. Something that we might want to do with our reset is sort of unstyle links by default. That's okay. So we're going to, how are we going to want to set this up, I wonder? Probably the best thing to do is give each one of these items the same vertical padding that we have for the logo, which is, it might not quite work the way that we want. So let's just kind of see what we get. Sorry, PY8 or 4. So this text isn't going to be centered because if you look, these aren't going to be tall enough. So I'm trying to think like what the best way to do this would be. The smart thing to do might be to increase the padding on this and use the padding on these elements to control the total padding of the whole thing. So that increases the padding here a little bit, which means like the padding that we have here is actually sort of irrelevant. And it would be better to use like just flex items center to make sure that that's centered with the rest of the content. So that's one approach that we can use there. And then we use that same treatment over here for each one of these. And we're going to have to make this flex. Or make these display inline block. Let's make these display inline block just to show off some other helpers. Okay. And then we want to make this text right, since these should be right aligned. We don't need the margin right on the last one. We don't need the margin right on the last one here either. Okay, so we're getting closer. So unstyling links. So I think we should do that in our reset, to be honest. So let's just say that links should have text decoration none, and maybe by default they'll have our text dark utility applied. Mix that. Might as well set this up to watch. We won't. We're still gonna need to restart it, but that's okay. And what does that give us? Okay. All right, cool. So next we're going to want to set the inactive state to a different color, right? So let's look at our JS file here. So it looks like inactive menu items were dark gray. And I think these are our only 3 text colors. So it's going to be gray darkest, gray darker, and gray dark. And actually, we're going to use icons for that. So we're going to have this one as well. So I'll show you the naming scheme that we've been using for text that I have been enjoying. So we pick like a dark text value, right? Which in our case is going to be gray darkest. And then rather than just like picking from the gray scale and putting that in the helper names, I find it more intuitive to name the helper names based on like the desired contrast that I'm trying to achieve. So this is like your highest contrast dark text. This is slightly lower contrast, lower than that, even lower than that. So dark softest for us is just going to be gray. Dark softer is going to be gray dark. This is going to be gray darker. So let's get this going again. Make sure things aren't broken. And then let's style those inactive links. So these ones, whoa. These are going to be text dark soft. Text dark softer? Did I get that wrong? Yeah, inactive menu is the softer. Okay, so that's one level lower in the contrast scale. Okay, so that's apparently the right color based on what we have here. Sketch anti-aliases things differently than the browser. So fonts always look a little bit lighter in weight. So that might impact how we do some of the things in this design. Although if we just want to mimic the text or Sketch's anti-aliasing, we can add this text smooth helper, which sets font smoothing to anti-aliased. And that'll get us closer to what things look like in Sketch. Okay, so the next thing that we want to try here is adding this active state border to the bottom, which is like a 2-pixel border. So we look in the config file and we look at borders. Again, you won't have to be looking at this config file all the time. I'm just trying to demonstrate it. But we do have like a 2 modifier to have a 2-pixel border. So here, if we wanted this active one to have a bottom border of 2 pixels, we could say border B2. And then we're probably going to want to say, you can name these colors however you want, right? Like some people want to say border brand or border primary. I used to really prefer doing that, and I used to be really opposed to just using colors. But now I'm actually pretty content to just say border green. So let's make sure that we have a green border available. So we do have a green border. We don't need any of these borders. Green is like the only color that we actually need. I think green and default. So let's get rid of everything that we don't need. And that'll cut down on our file size, which is nice and kind of simplifies everything. So we have a green modifier. Otherwise, like default borders are this gray light color. So let's map green to be our green backgrounds color here. So we already have like a green in our color scale. So I'm just going to override it to this green. I'm also going to override green dark to the green that we're using for text. Then I'm going to delete. I'm actually just going to delete every color that we're not using in this design. I think those 2 greens are actually the only 2 colors in the whole design, if I'm not mistaken, besides gray. So that means that we can pretty comfortably get rid of, I'll keep black and I'll keep white. And I'll move these grays down here. We're going to have an issue here where things are not going to compile because actually they will compile, so that's fine. I was thinking they wouldn't compile for a second because we removed some colors from the color palette, and a lot of things are going to be trying to look up colors in the color palette. So for text, we just need green dark. We'll keep all these backgrounds for now. We're going to probably need to play with those a little bit. We'll keep all these backgrounds for now. They're going to need to have their values changed, but that's okay. We actually will need green and green dark, but that's it. Again, just getting rid of any colors that we're not actually using. And I think that's it. So the file is, quite a bit smaller. We'll come back and figure out what grays we actually need to use for our background scale, though. Okay. So things are looking good. Here's our 2-pixel border, which is cool. These 2 links, I think, are also supposed to get that same inactive sort of color. So let's add that. So we'll do text dark soft around each of these. Okay, cool. I'm not going to worry about responsive stuff. We're not going to make any progress in like, an hour and a half stream doing that. So that maybe will be a topic for another stream, because Tailwind does have lots of really cool responsive utilities that are really flexible. But let's just try and get this design looking like it does in Sketch. So the next thing we'll focus on is this subheading here. So we haven't really been thinking too much about font sizes, which honestly I'm not too concerned about, but it looks like Steve has chosen reasonable sizes for the most part here. This font size is 19, which I would never use, but that's okay. We'll just kind of tweak as we go. We don't need to mimic it exactly. Pixel for pixel, implementing a design always goes badly in my experience. So what do we have here, though? Looks like we got like kind of similar padding to this section, so I think we can probably get away with putting that padding. It looks like the padding is going to be tighter around this element. So let's just add the padding to the top level here. We'll say like PY4 maybe, and just see what that kind of gives us. We're going to want to make this whole thing display flex. And we'll probably want to do justify between, to do justify content space between, which should shove these on either end, which is kind of cool. I don't know if alignment has been thought about too carefully here, if this is baseline aligned with that, or if it's center aligned. So why don't we just say items center for now. Doesn't actually change anything. We're going to need to style this input, which will be fun. So this form heading, looks like it was, 24 pixels? So let's look at our config file and see what values we have. So if we look at text sizes, we don't actually have one for 24 pixels, but I don't think we're going to have this 28 pixel one. So why don't we figure out what it would be? 1.5 rem. So we'll make 2XL be the 1.5 rem. And we'll change that to 24 pixels. And why don't we get rid of the other two since we're not going to need them? And just roll with that. So this form heading is going to get a class of text 2XL, which should set the size to be what we want it to be. It's 28. Yep. I'm glad that issue with having to restart mix was pointed out. It is kind of annoying. So we'll have to think about how we want to do that. Okay. It's bold right now. It looks like here we have it as regular. So instead of, our headings haven't been reset, right? So it's just getting the regular headings font weight. It's 20 pixels? Oh yeah, I was looking at the height. Okay, well then. In that case, we can use text XL. Cool. Yeah, it's very different from inline styles in the sense that, I mean, with inline styles, you have like complete flexibility in terms of what you're doing, right? I can set every single element to have a totally different font size. It's just an arbitrary value I've picked from nowhere. The purpose of doing things this way is to give you kind of a fixed set of utilities where you have to choose and keep yourself sort of constrained to a reasonable set of values. So if you only have, in this case, what do we have here? Like, actually, this is actually an alias. So we only have 6 text sizes on the whole site, the way that we've got this configured. I mean, that's going to keep your design a lot more consistent. Something worth pointing out too is one of the big selling points to me of Tailwind is that you don't have to go whole hog on this approach, right? So let me show you something just to kind of demo a cool feature of Tailwind while we're here. Say that like we noticed this pattern happening a lot, right? And we were kind of like realizing, okay, like this should be a component. I don't want to like duplicate these styles over and over and over again. We can make a component for this. So what I would probably do is I would import it here. I would do something like import components / nav or something, right? And this is going to fail until we make that file. But why don't we just like make a nav component just to demo. So I have nav.less here. Things are breaking, but that's okay. So let's think about how we would want this to be like designed. First of all, there's some things here that I wouldn't want to bake into the component. This width 1/2 thing, that's contextual. That's because of the fact that it's in this section with these other two things. So I would leave that as a utility. But flex and justify center, that is like required for this thing to like generally work. So what I would do is I'm going to make a new class here. I don't know, we'll call it like, I guess we'll just call it nav. And the nav is going to have these two classes, right? So let's cut those classes out, replace this with nav. And then here we can just say add apply. And these are the two utilities that we want to apply. We can put these on separate lines if we want, but you can also just put them on one line. Okay. So if we've done everything correctly here and things are compiling correctly, we should have the same like output, but maybe it's because mix is busted. Okay, let's run it again. Okay, so we're back to the exact same output that we had before, but now we've created like an abstraction around those two utilities, right? Same thing for all these items, okay? So something that's common between all of these is py6. Actually, py6 and mr8, right? So say we wanted to have like a .nav item class now for this component. We could say that this nav item, they should all have mr8 and py6 at the bare minimum, except for maybe the last child, where we apply .mr0 to undo it, right? Which is this sort of like undoing styles is something you typically don't do with utilities, but with the components is very common. So now we can replace all this with nav item and replace this py6 with nav item and then head over here. All right, and things are still looking the same, which is good. This is what an active nav item should look like, right? So let's cut that out and just say we have like a nav item. Maybe it's like a -- active modifier or something like that. Then here I can say nav item -- active, apply these utilities. The interesting thing so far, right, is we haven't written any real CSS. We haven't written a single property. Everything is composed entirely of utilities. So this whole workflow of basically finding repeating patterns in your utilities and extracting those to components is something that like Tailwind encourages. The thing is, in my experience, you tend not to need to extract as much as you might think. So I like this idea of building with utilities first, and then only when it becomes painful to maintain this combination of utilities, extracting to a component. And my experience is that by working that way, you actually end up making less components than you did when you were working component first, but you still have the power to create these components whenever you want. The reason that using these utilities to build components is better than raw CSS is that the values are consistent, right? If I use raw CSS here, maybe I say that like this is like margin right of 11 pixels, and that's the only place in my whole project that this value of 11 pixels exists. And by using a utility, I'm forced to be constrained to like configured values that make my designs more consistent. and reduce the number of weird values in my CSS. Like if you look at CSS stats, look at like GitLab's CSS. Oh fuck, it doesn't work anymore. Look at, I don't know, basically any of these are pretty bad. See if these still work. So like this is to me what happens when you let yourself write a lot of new CSS all the time. Help Scout has 198 text colors on their site. They have 133 background colors. They have 67 font sizes. Like what site needs 67 font sizes? You know what I mean? So by building everything utility first and forcing yourself to choose from like a constrained set of values, you never end up in this situation where people on your team are just inserting arbitrary values into style sheets and things are just growing out of control forever. Anyways, let's just keep extracting this component just like out of curiosity's sake. So that is what it is. Let's see how that looks. Still looks the same. When extracting this, I would probably bake the text color into the active one. So I would say that the active one should be text dark. And by default, they would all be text dark softer. So that should look the same. And it does. And now if we head over to this index file, we can actually delete this. And now we've created like a reusable component, but we didn't actually have to write any new CSS. All we really did was extract our utility patterns out into a higher level reusable abstraction. Like there's nothing fancy or new here. It's just like using the same stuff that we could have just done in the DOM, no problem. So that's an interesting piece of this whole sort of framework and approach, and something that I think is kind of really valuable. Okay, so off of that tangent for a while, let's get back to business here. Let's do some basic styling on this input. So form controls are actually one of those things that are interesting to style with utilities, I'll say. But the way it's going to look here is we're going to want to give it like a appearance none so that it looks the same on all browsers so that we can style it from scratch, right? Like reset it basically. So we have a utility for basically letting you reset things, removing the browser's default styling completely so you have sort of a clean slate. So we'll set it to appearance none. It looks like Steve gave this like a 2-pixel border. We could keep a 2-pixel border if we want. We could just say border 2. It's probably going to need some padding and stuff. So why don't we say that it needs like a vertical padding of 2 and a horizontal padding of 4. Let's see what that looks like. And that's getting there. And it needs rounded corners, so let's make it rounded. And that's probably okay. That vertical padding might be too much, but it's not the end of the world. One thing we don't have is utilities for styling placeholder text, which is something like I don't think is worth figuring out. I feel like for the most part, you're going to be creating components for things like form controls, but we won't go there right now. I can't decide, should we look at this magnifying glass right now, or should we get on to the rest of the design? Let's do the rest of the design and come back to the magnifying glass. Okay, so next thing, I want to set this gray background on the whole body here. So if we look at the Tailwind.js file where I kind of had created our color palette here, the page background is this lighter gray color, which is gray lighter. And if we look at the way I have backgrounds set up, again, using that sort of contrast-driven approach, we have like a light background, then we have like a lower contrast light background, even lower contrast. So like this starts at pure white and gets darker and darker. This starts at pure gray and gets lighter and lighter. So I think that page background is the second lightest background on the page besides white. So I think we're going to want that to be BG light softer, which is, nope, that's text, so this color. So instead of gray 300, we're going to set that to gray lighter. So this will be gray lighter. This will be gray lightest. And then I don't know that we actually need gray light here, but we'll keep it there. It looks like on this design we actually don't have any dark backgrounds. So let's just delete the dark backgrounds for now. It's getting hot in my basement here. Holy. Okay, and then unfortunately we have to restart our asset compilation because we made a change to the config. Okay, so now what we want to do is, there's two ways that we could style this body thing, right? We could set it in here. So one way to do it would be to say that the body should apply the BG Softer class. So if you're interested in doing stuff with CSS, you could do that, although that might not actually work. Is this not compiling? Apply BG Softer. Oh, sorry. Apply BG Light Softer. Okay, so that's compiled now. I can never remember if the body gets like a full height by default. It does. Okay, so that's one way that we could do it, right? We could bake it into the CSS. Honestly, I think it's easier to just bake that into the markup. So we'll just add a class to the body instead of actually adding any CSS to the body. And that gives us sort of like the same result. I think we have a border at the bottom of this as well. It's really subtle, but if I'm not mistaken, it's the same color, ECF F01. ECF F01. So we'll add a border bottom border to this whole header as well. So we'll say border B, and that won't be in the container because it's supposed to be full width. And it's very subtle, but you can see it is there. Next, we need two columns. Okay, so columns is interesting in Tailwind currently. I'd like to create a higher level grid abstraction eventually, but we focused on the lowest level utilities first. So the way that you would do this is just using percentage width helpers. So after this header, we're going to have a div for like the main body area, right? Then inside of that, we're going to have two other divs. This top div is going to be display flex, and then these divs are each going to have a width of something. We don't know yet what they will be. What is the width on this? 847, and this is like 263. I mean, we have percentages that let you do like a 12 column grid. If I was looking at this, I mean, to me, this looks like maybe it's kind of a weird width, actually. Let's start with what would be 1/6 for this one and 5/6 for this one. And just to kind of see what the size is here, let's give them all like a padding of 8, and maybe we'll make this one BG green and this one like BG light. I don't know, just so we can kind of see the difference. Okay, so we also need to put these in a container, and 1/6 looks like it's not going to be big enough. So we can do a container here, MX auto, so that it's centered. All right. Then instead of 1/6 and 5/6, why don't we try like 3/4 and 1/4? And how does that compare here? I mean, that actually looks like pretty close. So these don't have any gutters, right? That's something to keep in mind. But you can add gutters really easily because, again, we can just do it with utilities. So all we need to do here is basically add a row, which I typed that out of habit from Bootstrap, but there actually is no row helpers. What we actually want is negative margin helpers. So say that we wanted a gutter of 2 rems between each one, like a 32 pixel gutter or whatever. That would mean that we would want to compensate for that with like a 1 rem gutter on the outside, right? So we could do that with a negative X margin of 1 rem. And if we look at that, that should pull things out to the side, and it looks like we broke things in an interesting way because I have the flex on the wrong element now. So that should be here now. Okay, so now you can see like we get that little bleed happening at the edge. So now to kind of simulate gutters, all we have to actually do is make sure that each one of these like columns compensates for this, right? So we could just say px4 and each one of these to get padding to compensate for the margin. And now if we put some text inside each one, like hello world, Something doesn't look right here. Margin left 1 rem. Oh, we got P8. We can get rid of that now. That was defeating our X margin. Okay, so now I can see like we got that nice tight edge, and this basically, we have a gutter that's here, essentially. Okay. So we have this thread list. So let's get rid of like these backgrounds and just kind of do this more intelligently. So let's work on the thread list first. So inside the column, so inside the padding, we're going to have a container with rounded borders. So let's add a dot rounded helper here. And then we have all these threads in my routes file here. So let's just loop over these threads and kind of just like start spitting out some of this information. For each threads as thread. I never really know semantically like what something like this should be. I guess it could be an H2. That's typical, I guess, but I always wonder if that's actually what it should be. So let's put like the thread title here. Let's just kind of see what that gives us on this page. Okay, so we got a bunch of like threads that I stole from Laracast and the Laravel IO forum. So we had some realistic-ish data. Okay. So let's look at this. Like we're going to have like maybe a 1 rem padding on each one of these cards. So that's going to be inside the loop. Dot rounded dot P4. What do we got there? Okay. We can give this whole thing a white background. Okay, so it looks like we're going to want a bottom margin underneath this header too. So here where we have this border B, let's do like a MB4, something like that. That seems like pretty close. And let's see what font size we're using here. So this is font size 19. So I think we can just roll with, we can either roll with 18 or 20 based on our current scale. I think it's just easier to use our current scale than it is to try and match the design perfectly. Where am I even looking here? I think making things all a little bit tighter would be nice. Let's just roll with text large. So make each one of these H2s have a class of text LG. All right. And it looks like we have like a bottom border between every single one, except for the last one, which will be something to think about how we want to solve that problem. But let's just pretend that we have that on all of them for now. Okay. Did I make each one of these rounded? We don't need this to be rounded. Okay, so the next thing is this, the comment count, So there's two ways that we could think about this card, right? We could either think about it as like two sort of columns where there's this and then like this. We could think about this as being like a single row where these are sort of like aligned. We could think of this as being like one big container with some padding and like an absolute positioning to put that there. A couple different ways we could do it. I'm trying to think about which way I think would be nicest. Why don't we do it the absolute positioning way just to sort of be able to demo some of those helpers. So we'll add the comment stuff last. So underneath this H2, we'll stick like a P tag for the text preview, for the thread preview. See what that gets us. Font size on that is 15. So if we're going down this route of just making everything smaller, let's just roll with text small to make that 14. Yeah, I think making things pixel perfect leads to bloated CSS a lot of the time, unless you're working with really diligent designers who are really careful about the values that they're providing. I think if you're working in an environment where there's sort of like a toss over the wall design development process, it's very easy to end up with very hard to maintain CSS and markup if you're trying to make things pixel perfect. In that case, I would recommend the development team sort of enforcing the design system. And if things have to be 1 pixel off here or there to reduce the number of values in the resulting style sheet, I think that's a better approach. So I think this color is, we can see in the config, preview text is dark gray. So that's going to be text dark softer. It's the second level of lower contrast. So we'll make it text dark softer. We got some margin underneath there, but I'm surprised that that's not looking good enough with just line height. So I'm curious what our line height is. Okay, so we don't have like a very good default line height. So we have a leading helper for normal, which is 1.5. So if we want to enforce that across like the whole site, then I think what we should do is just add like leading normal to the body tag. And if everything's inheriting from that, then we should be all right. So that made everything a little bit bigger, but I still think it's okay. We could go and tweak this padding if we wanted to. But it makes some of this stuff look a little bit nicer. We could even just say letting none, which is like super hardcore, and then control everything by setting the line height on each piece individually or with bottom margin. Maybe we'll try that approach. So under here, we'll maybe add like a short bottom margin, like an MB2. And then we got like this kind of metadata section underneath. So let's do that. So add like another div here. And in this div, we have these avatars. I have an SVG file for that from Steve's Zondacon's stuff, which is kind of cool. So we'll grab SVG avatar. That's going to need a class. I don't know quite what yet. I think it's actually going to be text dark softest. So this is actually making use of that this reset I was telling you about here, where we rely on that current color thing. This, I don't know what that's going to look like. Probably massive. So we're going to need to size that. What's the size here? It's like 20 by 20. So that's like 1.25 rem. And if we look at our sizing, we don't have 1.25. So here's like a good example of like, okay, maybe you need to add a size that's not baked into Tailwind. And because we used a proportional scale, there's room to add 5. So let's give width and height. We'll add that extra value. We're not using basically any of these other ones. So again, in like our journey to attempt to clean things up as much as possible and reduce the file size, you could go back and audit what's being generated and delete stuff that you're not using. Takes a long time to implement stuff when you're trying to like justify every decision and walk through everything and explain it all. Okay, so we'll give this like an H5 and a width 5. Yeah, so now we got like a nice little dude there. Let's wrap both of these in a div. So we can give this a bottom margin. I don't really like applying just like a bottom margin just to here to space it out from here. If when you look at it, it's like kind of logically clear that this is a content area and this is a content area. So a lot of the time I'll introduce wrapper elements just to add margins in a way that feels like I'm adding a margin to the group rather than just trying to push things and nudge things around to get values to be the way I want them to be. Okay, so 2 is not enough. Let's go with 4. Seems better. Then we have the author of the thread. So let's just stick the auth. How do I want to do this? We'll just try and do it right here for now. Thread author. See what we get. We're going to want to do a bunch of funky centering stuff. So yeah, I think I'm going to want to put this all in a p tag. Give this like a class of flex and justify or items center. And that'll let us center the text with the avatars nicely and easily. Font size on this is quite small though, 13. We'll make it 12, I guess. This whole thing could be that size. These are going to be links. So let's wrap those in an A tag with a class of text green dark. And then we have like replied 21 minutes ago. I don't have seed data for that, so I think we'll literally just type that out exactly as it appears there. We'll just keep that the same for all of them. And we'll set this whole thing to have like a text dark softer, I think. Yeah. So what is this? This is text SM, which is 14. This is, I think we actually want that to be smaller. Text XS, not SM. Extra small. Cool, so let's add a little bit of a right margin to this avatar. So we'll do like an MR2, see how that looks. It's pretty good. And then we've got some tags that show up next to that. So to me, that says that we need another div wrapping all of this stuff. So let's add a div here. We'll use display flex on that div. I don't know how I ever built anything without Flexbox. Then this is where the tags are going to go. So here we can say for each thread tags as tag. Let's just render them all here. Just make sure that things are getting dumped out sort of in a reasonable way. Yeah. So now we want to style those. Font size 11. We got to go even smaller on our font size. How do we want to do this? Let's just wrap each one of these in a span with an inline block with a PY1 and like a PX2 and like what do we got for the background on those? Tags is darker gray, so that's going to be, oh no, that's the colors. I think we'll have to look at Sketch here. Hopefully we have this color. EEF3F6. I don't think we actually have that color. Steve's a typical designer throwing shit over the wall with too many fucking colors. So we can just kind of pick one by eye and see, using our existing colors, what looks pretty good. Let's go with BG Light Softer. The way that I'm picking these names, by the way, is you might not think that this is like a light background, right? But if the text that you'd put on it is dark, then I think of it as a light background. That's probably fine. We'll make each one of these text XS. We'll give them like a rounded SM. So it's like a tight rounded border. And I think we probably want to go like text dark, softer, or something to lower that contrast. That's a little too much. Soft, that's pretty good. And then we're going to want like a little bit of a right margin between the two divs. So let's just do like an MR4 here and see what that looks like. How does that compare to this? We could probably go bigger. We could probably say MR6. Spread those tags out a little bit more. I do think it might be worth making these smaller. So let's do the evil thing of adding yet another font size. We'll call it 2XS. 10 pixels is pretty small, but I don't think 11 pixels. 11 pixels, okay, 6875, whatever. So we got 11, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20. Type scale nerds are probably screaming in their chairs right now, but I don't think it's too bad, really. Okay, so let's change this to text to XS. And again, this is like a good example of where you might want to create a component. So it's actually an interesting discussion because you might see this and think, oh, wow, this is an annoying combination of classes. If I'm going to be doing this all the time, I want to write a component. But like we only wrote this combination of classes once because it's like in a loop. It's all dynamically generated. This would only really be worth dealing with if there's other sites or other pages on the site that also have tags, you know. But again, I don't know. Why don't we just like do it for shits? Let's just replace this with a tag class or like a badge. And then we'll take this nav utility or component. We'll duplicate this as badge. We'll say that a badge should apply all of these. Use some Sublime Text wizardry here. Add apply dot. Head over here and import components badge. And wait for that to be done. Yep. So now we have a badge component, which inherits all these styles by just mixing in all our utilities, which is cool. Tailwind has tons and tons of responsive stuff. I will have to dedicate a whole screencast to it. But basically every single one of these utilities you can control responsively. I'm trying to think if there's one here that would be like a good quick example. Say like this one here. So that right there is where we have this bottom border. Say we wanted this to be a 1 pixel border on smaller screens and then like a big pixel on large screens. All you'd have to do is say LG border B4. And now it's 4 pixels wide on this screen, but as we go down, it goes back to a single pixel border. So the responsive classes work very similar to what you'd be used to with Bootstrap, where you'd have like column classes and you would just specify the screen size. We do things a little bit differently in Tailwind, where we use the breakpoints as a prefix with a colon. I think this ends up reading nicely because it feels like the class name hasn't changed. You know what I mean? Like this is the exact same as this class, except here we're just sort of classifying it or sort of saying like this should only be applied when the screen is large. So you can do this with like everything. Like you could have this be display flex normally. On small screens, it could be inline block. On medium screens, it could be block. On large screens, it could be inline. On extra large screens, it could be flex again. So every single utility is responsive. Another cool thing about Tailwind, if you wanted to make your own classes responsive, all you have to do is wrap them in this @responsive helper. So say we want responsive badges where something is only a badge on certain screens, we just have to do this. And now badge is responsive. So if we go down and look at where we have badge being used here, if we refresh it, everything's going to be the same. But I could say here that I only want this to be a badge on extra large screens. So now it's not a badge. Now it is a badge. So you just automatically create responsive versions of your classes by just wrapping them in this custom @rule. And now responsive version exists. And you can do that for your own utilities, your own components, whatever you want. Pretty cool shit. All right, anyways, this is like looking closer and closer. Let's deal with the sidebar. So we got a button. Buttons are always an interesting example to talk about, especially in a utility-based framework. So let's start by inside of our column adding another div. I try to keep like my styles. I try to not to mix styles in the sense that like these styles are here to create a column. Any styles I put on the inside of that, I don't want to bake into the column. I want the column to just live as a child of the column, so the column is like independent, very like compositional. So the only reason I'm doing this is because if you look here, we got a little bit of padding at the top, and that's there to sort of make this button feel more balanced with like this text. If you shove this all to the top, it looks a little bit weird. So let's add a class here where we give us like a top padding. Probably we'll give it like a full vertical padding actually. py2. And then we'll put this button in its own div. And then we'll put the tags list in its own div. So let's add a button here. It's actually going to be a link styled like a button. So what is it? Create thread. Okay, so here's our ugly button. So from Bootstrap and stuff, you're probably used to doing stuff like button primary or whatever, right? This is not baked into Tailwind. This is something we might add as like a theming layer in the future. But my experience is that every site buttons look different, and there's no generic button we can provide that's going to work for everybody. So it's better to stay at a lower level and let people kind of compose the utilities into what they want. Some people might want square buttons, some people might want rounded, some people might want font weight to be different. Bootstrap lets you do that by changing a bunch of gnarly Sass variables. I'd rather just let you build it yourself from the utilities. And hopefully in the future, we'll be able to provide like kind of Tailwind themes that kind of have component sets baked into them that have some more visual design opinions. But for now, that's not how it's going to work. So what we are going to do here is set this to display block, so it takes up the whole width. Ugh. BG of green, PY2, PX4, text center, maybe text bold, maybe text light because it's white. And there's like half of a button, right? Okay, so it needs to have rounded corners. Needs to be a little bit taller. Let's go with PY3, PX4. It's looking pretty good. You notice it has no hover state, right? So something that's traditionally been tricky with utility frameworks is how do you specify what happens when the mouse cursor is over there? We're doing that with a prefix. So if you use the @ prefix, you can stick that in front of a select variety of classes that also have versions that only apply on hover. So here, if we want the background to be dark green on hover, we just say @background green dark. And this is just kind of saying on hover, make it look this way. It also does it this way on focus. I think this is kind of like an interesting metaphor. You're kind of saying like when you're at this element, this is how it should be styled. And that could mean when the mouse is at the element or when the keyboard is focused on that element. So if we look at that now, you'll see, yeah, we get like a hover state, and we did that all with utilities. Again, if you wanted to make like a button class, probably the way that I would do it is you would look for stuff that makes sense to be in the button, right? In this case, buttons shouldn't all have the block display built in, right? Most buttons are going to be inline block. So I wouldn't extract this. I would only extract the stuff that's going to be the same in every green button. So you could create a component out of just those classes, and then maybe it's like a couple components actually, right? Like if you look at it, probably text light, BG green, and hover BG green dark. These are specific to this variation of the button, the green button. These are going to be generic to every button, and this is specific to this context where it's used. So what you might end up with is these elements getting replaced with a higher order sort of component called the button, and then these elements getting replaced with another component called button primary or button green. I'm not too worried about it. This is the only time the button exists, so we'll just do it all in the markup. Oh man, what am I doing? Okay. Next is this tags list. So maybe this is like an H3 or something for tags. And it looks like it's going to be probably like text dark softer. So we'll say text dark softer. What's the font size on that? 12 pixels. So that's like text small, or maybe text extra small actually. It's going to be text uppercase. And it's going to be tracking wide because the letter spacing is wide. So there we go. That might be too wide letter spacing. We might want to think about that default. But again, we want to have some margin underneath the button, right? We could have just had no div here and just put the margin directly on the button. Again, I prefer to give it a wrapper component to apply the margin. It feels like this is like a layout block, and this is just like something in that block. And the margin belongs on the thing that sort of is building blocks in the layout, in my opinion. We could probably go a little bit bigger on that. Good enough. Then we got a list of tags here. I'm just going to copy all these and stick those in our route so we have them dynamically to loop over. Okay, so there's our tags. Pass those through as well. And now we want to iterate over the tags. So, I mean, we can make this like an unordered list, although we don't have helpers for lists yet. So let's just make it a div with some links in it. Okay, so let's just render each one out here as a starting point. We'll make this an A tag that goes to nowhere with the tag inside of it. And these are going to want to be display block at the very least. Cool. Looks like they all have a little bit of padding, like maybe like a PY2 and then like a PX, I don't know, PX3. Actually, I don't even know. I added this here because like a inline block button would have like horizontal padding, but in the block case, it doesn't really matter, but that's fine. So let's do PY2, PX4, see what that looks like. Looks too aggressive on the horizontal padding. Let's go with PX3. Text small, I think. Yeah. Okay. It's probably pretty close, honestly. And under this, we'll add like a margin bottom of 2. And I'm trying to think what we should do for the active tag handling. Not really from a CSS perspective, but from a making it easy to do in the template perspective. Why don't we'll duplicate this for now, and we'll do collect tags slice 1. And this will be tags 0 for now. Just so we can style the top one differently. So this will have like a background of light soft. If I'm looking correctly here, it's like a slightly lighter gray background. Looks like it should have a rounded border. And it also looks like the text should be bold. And I'm pretty sure the text here should be lighter. Text dark soft. And looks like we want some bottom margin underneath each one of these too. Maybe just like MB2. Might be too much. It's a little too much. It's just to MB1. Just a quarter rem little gap between each one. And that's like the most of it done. Actually, we got to do these comments and we got to do this magnifying glass. So we could still do those quickly. Let's do it. Okay, so comments. I think the way to do this, we'll give this like a padding. So this block basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some extra padding to the right so that we never have a problem of this bleeding into that. We also are not going to run into like a text truncation problem here, but that's easy to handle in Tailwind too. Like we can actually just add like a text truncate class, and we're not going to see that get applied because none of these are long enough. But say we add like some lorem ipsum text there or whatever, and what's going on? Is it not text truncate? It might be text ellipsis. Maybe we don't have that utility baked in right now. Public app CSS, let's see. Ellipsis, wrap truncate. I forgot we changed some of this stuff. Okay. So it's like a little bit different naming. Okay, so you can see like this would be problematic because like this is going to blow out that comment, right? So I'll keep that there just for a second, and I'll show you what we would do. So if we want to have like a padding 4 on all sides, but we want one side to be bigger, we might be able to just do like padding right 12 and have that work. But in this case, it's getting blown out because padding 4 actually dominates. Actually, it might just be because we don't actually have 12 defined. Yeah, okay, so we can do 8. So let's add an extra one here in our spacing helpers. So I'll add a 3 rem. So we can do padding right 12. So there's 2 ways that you could do this, right? Like you could just say py4, so the vertical padding is 4, and then the padding left is 4, and then the padding right is 12. This is probably the better way to do it, honestly. Trying to override styles, you're likely to run into weird conflicts. So there's that. I think actually we might want to go even bigger on the padding. Maybe like a 16, like a 4 rem. This is one of my longest streams ever. Yeah, okay, so that's fine. Let's get rid of all this lorem ipsum trash. And let's add these comments. So we're just going to have like a number and then like an icon, right? So we're going to want to position absolute an element over on the right there. So let's make this absolute. And let's just say hello there, just so we can kind of see where this is going to show up. Now, this is going to show up in a weird part of the page, I bet. Not too bad, but we are going to want to set this to be position relative. Otherwise, it's going to show up in a weird spot. So like, for example, we can like pin this to the top of the page by saying like pin T. Now it's going to go way up top here, which is not where we want it to go, because that's the nearest non-static positioned item. So this container, we need to be this needs to be like a position reference, right? So we can set this to position relative. And now each one of these should be at the top there. This is actually going to be an SVG icon, which is going to be svg.comment. And we'll have to give that a class of some kind. Don't know what yet. And then we're also going to have the threads. I think it's like reply counts, I called it. Something like that. Okay, so this is all in like a super stupid spot, right? So let's position that where we want it to go. So we'll pin it to the top. We'll pin it to the right. So that's going to be right in the top right. Let's give it a margin top 4 and a margin right 4 to sort of make up for the padding that we're not seeing anymore. Let's figure out what the font size is here. 12, so that's going to be text XS. So let's make this whole thing text XS. The color looks like it's our darkest text color, so that's okay. The SVG is going to be a different color, though. I think I have that up here in icons. It's just gray. So if we look at our backgrounds, do we have just a straight up gray background? Actually, it would be a text color. Dark softest. So this is going to be text dark softest. Then we'll use some sizing helpers to size it. So it's 14 by 14. What do we got for sizing? Yeah, that's going to be a weird one. 14 pixels is like 0.875. So we'll just make it a little bit smaller. H3, W3. And we'll make it inline. We'll make this flex. Items center. MR1. Something like that. MR2. Something like that. It's pretty close, I think. We could maybe drop, come in a little bit deeper here. This actually might not be a value. We might have to go with 6. I mean, that is not quite exactly what it is in the design, but we could tweak that and add different utility values if we wanted to, but you know, that's pretty good. The comment icon is XS too. Didn't I make it XS? Yeah. Cool. Yeah, so trying to implement this magnifying glass is going to be very similar to kind of what we did. We'd have like extra padding on the left, absolute position. I mean, we can do it really quickly if you guys are interested. Basically, we're going to have an extra wraperative here just so we can kind of style it on its own. This is going to be class relative. We're going to have an SVG here. SVG.search class absolute pin left. Let's just see what that even gives us. Yeah, that's looking pretty bizarre. We can go H4, W4 maybe. I think we're going to want to pin Y on that. And I think if we make this display, we might actually want to do this. We might want to go flex dot items center here and make this the absolute positioned elements. Just give this a size. It gets us kind of in the ballpark. And then just kind of give this a horizontal padding of 2 or something like that. Maybe 4. Give this a text color of like text dark softest. Then add some extra padding to the left here. So we're going to have maybe like a PL8. Then like a PR4. And maybe this is actually like a 12. You know, and that's pretty close. You could add another value of 10 if you wanted to. You probably would want to, I would probably make this a component because certain things are still going to be easier to style in CSS. But anyways, that's kind of like the finished deal in terms of getting to where we got with the design that me and Steve had kind of driven out here. So hopefully that was kind of like a fun example of what the workflow is generally like working with Tailwind CSS, and gives you sort of a cool intro to some of the interesting features and how it's sort of set up and the configuration and stuff like that. And also just kind of an interesting demo of what it's like to take a design like this and, you know, try and build it out with HTML and CSS. So yeah, I think this turned out pretty good. I'm happy with how little CSS we really had to write, right? Like if you look at how much CSS we actually wrote, it's basically none. We had like some setup stuff here just for like some basic reset stuff. So we had like a kind of a good starting point. We created some components just to sort of demo that workflow. We actually didn't really need to create them if we didn't want to. But other than that, it was just sort of porting over whatever the design team's decisions were about our color schemes and our type scale and stuff into a config file. And then from then on, you just hang out in the markup and you can kind of build a completely custom UI. This isn't like what Tailwind looks like per se, you know what I mean? We could build a site that looks entirely different. There's nothing kind of driving it towards this aesthetic. So I think that's what makes it kind of an interesting and powerful framework. So yeah, hopefully that was fun, and hopefully I can do another one of these down the road where we can dive into some responsive stuff a little deeper. Cool. Thanks everyone for coming and checking things out, and hopefully you'll have this framework in your hands at the end of the month. All right. See ya.